Assalamu alaikum ji, my name is Rizwan Beg. I am one of the pioneer designs of Pakistan, and I started my career in 1989, early 1990, and it's been a 30-year long experience. It's been a long journey. I've had some incredible experiences. I've had the wonderful support of all my colleagues, all my peers, all the journalists that I've worked with, all my critics, a lot of students who've actually given me a lot of respect and honor. Also, during my journey, it's taken me to many places. I've been fortunate enough to have dressed Lady Diana, which I think is a huge honor for somebody from Pakistan. Also, during my journey, we've actually worked with a lot of rural women. We started a foundation called the Bunyad Foundation, which actually works in favor of employing women in rural areas, in small towns all over Pakistan, predominantly in the southern Punjab region. I'm also fortunate to work as a consultant for the Sharjah government. I work with Sheikh Jawahir Al Qasmi, who has set up a training program where the women of Pakistan go abroad and train the women of the UAE. So the Marathi women, I can say with great pride, have been trained by the Pakistani women from our villages. So that's a huge feather in our cap. I was fortunate enough, because of this work ethic that we've done in supporting rural communities, to have received the Tamgha Imtiaz. It was recently given to me by the government, and in recognition of my work on the social development scene. We will of course continue to try and maintain our standards in terms of design as a design house, but more importantly, I think we will continue to strive to work towards the betterment of women, towards the betterment of communities, to better livelihoods, better income generation and gender equality. And to me, I think these are the reasons why I am a proud Pakistani. Today's topic is going to be something that I've always cherished, something that is the mainstream and the grassroots level of my business. It is about the art of embroidery, and today we're going to talk about embroideries in general and some embroideries more specifically. Of course, embroidery is a huge subject, and it will take many hours of discussing everything in detail. But I hope to give you a small taste of what embroidery means to this country, what it reflects in the traditions of these people, and how it brightens and embellishes your life. Okay, so embroidery actually started at a very rudimentary level. I mean, initially after the invention of the needle, which was actually used for stitching and for sewing, people then decided to do some kind of ornamentation. As you know that the human race always adorned themselves and always wanted to wear embellished clothes. It used to be initially with coins and with shells, and it eventually became where they used different kinds of horse hair and animal hair to use it. And then of course, with the invention of the spinning wheel and with the invention of the spindle, yarn was born. And then yarn also from from camels, from sheep, from cows. So those were the very basics of how embroidery started, and I'm talking about centuries ago. And then of course, because of the nature of embroidery and because of the nature of politics, you ended up with royalty, and you ended up with royal patronage, and you ended up with the craftsperson who actually worked very long hours in training themselves, working on different techniques, experimentation, because in those days there were no set rules. People actually experimented and created different textures and different stitches, and from there of course it started to get more and more elaborate and more expensive, and it reached a stage where it was so expensive that only royalty could afford it. So under the patronage of a lot of royals, whether it was the European royalty or whether it was under the Mughals of the subcontinent, or even if you look at Central Asia, a lot of the tribes, a lot of the communities that actually had sardars, and they had heads of state, all the patronage of all these kind of fine arts, whether it was music, whether it was art, whether it was painting, embroidery, clothing, all of that, it flourished during that time. And of course then there were numerous techniques that were involved, and there was a lot of exploration in different threads. And then of course there was the whole thing of the metallic thread. So because of the pomp and ceremony, a lot of the clergy, if you look at historically, if you look at what the popes used to wear, the big hats with the gold work on it and the cross, and if you see what happened in medieval times, the heavy embroideries, the Elizabethan and the Victorian, then of course you had things like lace making and weaving. So embroidery especially kind of became a master student craft, because it was not a tradition that you could actually do without actually having somebody to see how you did it. It was a visual experience. It was a practical experience. So there was this whole thing in the subcontinent. It was known as the Ustad Shagird. Ustad meaning master and Shagird meaning student. So the Ustad Shagird kind of relationship developed, and you had to devote your life to your Ustad. You had to sit there and you had to sit in the karkhana and learn all the trade and learn how the tricks of the trade, how it operated. And over a period of time, even the art of embroidery got kind of encapsulated into two forms of embroidery. And for them, the equipment that was needed was two different kinds of, you had the needle, which was the regular needle, which was used in different gauges. There was the thick needle and the thin needle and the very fine needle. And then you had what was like the crochet hook, which locally is called the R. So you have the Ari embroidery and then you have the needle embroidery. The needle embroidery that you use is generally referred to as Zardozi, but Zardozi is a very broad category. Zar actually means gold. So from the Persian word Zar, you have Zardozi, as in the art of working with gold. And that was the metallic, coil that was developed, and that started being used for a lot of the royalty, and eventually trickled down into the, all the queens and all the princesses wearing all these elaborate things. And then of course there was the Persian tradition as well, because the Mughals had come from Persia. So they brought with them all the flowers and all the buttas and all of that. That also got translated from architecture into clothing. So you had all the booties and you had all the, the different flowers and the silk thread. So it's a very interesting history, but obviously it's too long to go into, it's a whole series of, conversations on embroidery. But by and large, it started very rudimentary, it became very fine, it became a fine art, it was limited to the exclusive royalties, it was exclusive to the rich, but over a period of time, it started to then slowly kind of, merge into what ordinary people would wear. So now also if you look at the bridals that most designers do, it's mostly traditional. It's mostly what our grandmothers and our grandfathers wear, especially the bridal season. But then of course it got supplemented eventually as progress went on by the machine. So the computer then took over, and then embroidery today, because of mass production, is gradually more mass produced than it is hand embroidered. Finally, of course, if you are attending this workshop and you've taken time out to be part of this whole thing, I would strongly request you to click on the link below, fill in all your descriptions in the description box so that you can get your certificate of attendance, which will be given to you by TDAP. Okay, so the tradition of embroidery is actually based on two different kinds of materials. One is a natural yarn, which can either be a thread or silk, organic, and the other one is metallic, which forms the basis of Zardozi. Metallic embroidery is actually a long, thin coil of metal that is wound like that, and it's like a little spring. So the needle goes in the middle of the spring, and then you set it where you want, and the spring is cut at the right intervals to the length of the stitch that you want to do. Most embroidery that is done, and that was actually Zardozi was actually limited to the royals. Most embroidery that is done was actually done with the thread and needle, and it became a craft that was then taught at schools, at home economics colleges, at children at art school. There were little courses where people used to do stuff, and then different areas from Central Asia to Europe, to Central Europe, to the Far East, all had different techniques. And most of it, if you look at it, and if you look at the history of embroidery, silk embroidery is divided into different techniques. Metal embroidery is mostly surface embellishment, and it has a three-dimensional effect, right? But thread embroideries are different, because you have the whole concept of doing shadow work, which is where the stitch is taken from the underneath and pulled on top, and it creates a shadow. And that is also was very prominent in Europe, but it's also very common in Pakistan, because the whole southern Punjab belt of Bahawalpur does the chikankari dupattas, and then India does the whole chikankari kurtas, and that whole tradition of maintaining the shadow work. So shadow work has survived. There are a lot of stitches that have become obsolete, things like vasli, things like do, where vasli is when you actually have a cardboard piece that you cut out and then you stitch over it to get that flat effect. So those kind of things have actually become redundant, because it was, like I said, it was used mostly for royalty. But then within the thread tradition, there are so many varieties. Aside from shadow work, you have the gara, which is a silk floss embroidery which originated from China and then travelled because of the Chinese treasures to Gujarat, and the Parsis made it popular. And then you'll see a lot of the kind of imagery of China as well. Then you have, of course, the Marodi, which was kind of taken over by the Mughals, and places like Lucknow and places like Delhi, and all the prominent centers where the heads of state were. All their clothes were done in Marodi, and they were done with Zardozi and metalwork. So there was the Marodi tradition, which was again continued. Then of course the regular stitch which you do with the ari, which is the actual crewel, which is the chain stitch. So the chain stitch, of course, was easy to do because all you did was do long running strands of chain. This was also very popular. It was known as crewel embroidery, and very, very popular in Europe as well. And then of course it continues to maintain a hold. So certain embroideries have survived. They've actually come a long way, and they've actually become part and parcel of several cultures, not only here but also in the West. But craft has started to die because a lot of expertise from Europe did not survive. It did not survive the Industrial Revolution. People started relying heavily on machine made, because machine made was cheap, and also machine made was you could produce a lot of pieces. Hand embroidery was expensive and took a lot of time. So if you put two pieces parallel to each other and you make a machine embroidered piece and you make a hand embroidered piece in the same fabric, in the same design, you will produce 30 pieces in one day on the machine, and you will produce one piece in 30 days. So the comparison was very sharp. So the Industrial Revolution brought about a huge change in how people looked at embellishment. And over a period of time, the West actually went more and more simple because they couldn't pay for those kind of expenditures. And the aesthetic, because of the limitations of what they could produce, started to change. So you got the classic Italian suit. Whereas here the tradition was alive, and it went on because it became a means of livelihood, it became a vocational training. So mothers taught their daughters, and the most important thing was the dowry. So they taught their daughters to make their own dowries. So from a very young age, women would sit and they would start to embroider. And the rural tradition still continues. All the women get together in the courtyard, kettle of tea, they bitch about their husbands, they sit and they do all the embroideries, and they sing songs. And so these are it became cultural centers. And in Pakistan especially, this tradition was carried on all through the Punjab, a lot of places in the KPK, because we also have the parda system. So the men had to stay separate from the women. So the women would congregate, and then the tradition went from daughter to granddaughter, and it continued. And there are wonderful stories of the pulkari, which is a satin stitch on the shawl, and this is a lovely anecdote, I don't know if it's real or not, but the first stitch was put into the first shawl when the girl was born. And throughout her life, she would embroider the pulkari. And the strength of a girl's dowry was measured by the number of pulkari she bought in her dowry. And the last stitch was put on the last day of her wedding. So the tradition, it had a lovely romantic story to it. So the way the pulkari traveled, and the way embroidery became part and part of a culture, of a tradition, and the importance of that. And then even in the pulkari, they have the nazar battu. The nazar battu is interesting because they'll make a beautiful shawl which will be perfect. But in the corner, there will be one thing that will be imperfect, which is done deliberately. And it's to keep away the evil eye. It's to ward away all the black magic. So they have the nazar battu as well. So these are the stories that have come out of cultures and out of traditions and out of lots of embroidery technique. Okay, so basically most embroiderers will carry a case which is actually for dark glasses or for spectacles, but it houses all their needles, and this is pretty common all over Pakistan. Often you think that they're wearing glasses, but when you open it, it's actually a case of needles. And it's very interesting because these are all the ingredients for their trade. So this is what I was talking about, which is a variation of the crochet hook. It's actually a hook, and they come in different gauges. There's one which is very thick, there's one which is very thin, and it has a little hook at the end, which what they do is they pierce the fabric, they twist it, and they catch the yarn from underneath, and they pull it out, and they pull it to the top. And these are different gauges because what they do is they take one yarn for the single thread, and then they double it or quadruple it, and as the quantity of the yarn becomes bigger and bigger, if they want to do a thick chain stitch, they use the fattest needle, because that will grab 6 threads together, and the finest one will just grab one. So a lot of people don't know the details. They think all ari is the same, but it's not, because every time you change the stitch, you ask them, ye 6 tar hai, ye 8 tar hai, is it 6 threads, is it 8 threads? So the tradition of our embroidery or crewel embroidery, because this technique is also used in Europe today. When you look at the great design houses and embroidery houses in Europe that do all the embroideries for Dior and for Chanel and for all the YSL, they use a similar needle. It's the same, but it's slightly, this is kind of because it's Pakistan. It's very rustic and very basic. They obviously have fancier needles because it's old, Europe, and it's expensive. But the tradition and the technique is the same. You make a loop and you pull it through and you put it on. This is the same needle that is used to apply sequins. So you push it through the center of the sequin, you pull it out and you stitch the side so the sequin lies flat. Also, the same technique can be used with the flat needle, which is the traditional needle. Now the traditional needle also comes in different sizes. This is the very finest one, and then of course you have all the other needles which are thicker ones. And as the yarn changes and as the size of the yarn and the gauge changes, so does the needle. So embroidery is much more technical than people think it is. And even the way the embroidery works and the way you transfer design is also a very interesting process, because initially when you do large quantities of embroidery, like if you're doing stuff which is in quantities, what they do is they use blocks for the design, and they block printed the design, which was the outline, and then it was filled in. So this combined a block printing technique with an embroidery technique, and it's still practiced in some areas of Melsi and Multan in Pakistan.
They use screens also nowadays?
They used to use screens, but what is more common now is the process where you actually get what is a printout. So you have a printout of the kind of design that you want to do, and then under the piece that you've taken out, this is a computer print. So you design the piece on the computer, or you download it from a source, and then you take this and then you attach a tracing sheet to it, and then what you do is you run the outline under the embroidery machine. So the machine punctures the holes in it. And initially what they used to do is they used to do it with a needle or a pin by hand. But then ever since mechanization came, they got away from the hand, and all you do is give it to a machine embroiderer and they'll run the needle all over. And what that does is it creates tiny little perforations, tiny little holes. So if you look at it like that, you'll see that there are tiny holes in this. Then what you do is you take the piece of fabric on which you want to embroider, you set it on an embroidery frame, and you place this on top, and you make a paste of kerosene and of zinc powder, which is called sufeda, which is basically whitener, and then you run it over the holes, so the design gets translated onto the fabric. But if the fabric is white, you can't do white on white. So what we do is we take a little bit of shoe polish or a little bit of Robin Neal, and we mix that in the kerosene and we run it over the paper, and that's what it does, is it gives you the design on the fabric. And once the design is there on the fabric, I don't know if you can see this, but once the design is on the fabric and it's on the frame, then the process of actually embellishing it starts. Finally, of course, if you're attending this workshop and you've taken time out to be part of this whole thing, I would strongly request you to click on the link below, fill in all your descriptions in the description box, so that you can get your certificate of attendance, which will be given to you by TTAP. So one of the most kind of popular embroideries that has actually stood the test of time and is gone into a revival mode now is the traditional Gara. Gara was actually based on the Chinese traders that used to come down the Silk Road. They bought with them embroidered pieces, and then of course it kind of like it happens globally, most cultures kind of meld together. So when these embroiderers used to come, the Parsis who had actually come from Persia and had settled in Gujarat, they were very fascinated by the kind of embroideries. And if you look at some of the embroideries, they actually have little Chinese temples and little Chinese men, and they were very interested. So they said often when these traders used to come, they used to come with cushions and they used to come with little mats, all done in this work, which was basically silk floss, hand embroidered on a satin finish. So this was the kind, and it was mostly flora and fauna. So it was either animals and flowers, and eventually it became just birds and flowers. But you find some which have deer on it, very much like our shikargas, which are very typical of this part, which is the royal party that used to go hunting, and it was actually translated into embroidery. But the Gara actually was then, the Parsi women then decided that they wanted to wear this embroidery on their saris. And the sari then became the central piece. And the Chinese embroidery of course stayed true to China, and it was stuck on the kimonos and on their robes. and also on their paintings. But then as it came into the subcontinent, it gradually got converted onto the sari. And there are books on the Gara and how it survived and how it changed and how it translated, and eventually then from the traditional sari it actually started getting onto the Shalwar Kameez. So today now you will find, initially you would not find Gara on Shalwar Kameez, but a lot of people who revived the Gara and who went back to it, all the early original Chinese pieces you will not find a Shalwar Kameez. But then you started finding dupattas, you started finding kameezes, you started finding kurtas, and lots of shawls as well. It's very similar to the Filipino shawl, the Manila shawl, which is a multicolored form of Gara. So the Gara was the most kind of prominent, almost it was like a status symbol to own a number of Garas, and all obviously very hand embroidered, took a long time and was very expensive.
They were passed on to.
And they were obviously passed on because of the Parsis tradition of passing on generation to generation. So you have some Garas which are like over 100 years old. And of course, some of them are complete museum pieces and very difficult to replicate. So this was one of the main things that came out of it. We talked about a lot of the different kinds of embroidery. And one of the things that have survived and has made a huge revival is actually Gota. And Gota is actually a metallic ribbon which comes in different sizes, very thin, very broad, very, very broad. It's by and large used a lot, mostly in bridal wear. It's become a staple at most mehndis. The bridal shower, when you have the Sangeet. So a lot of people wear Gota. It's very much part of the old tradition of Hyderabad and Bhopal and the Muslim tradition where Gota was used excessively. And of course then it got translated into embroidery, and then they invented something called the Gota Patti, which was actually a strip of Gota which was basically metallic. It was a metallic flat thread, and what they did was they cut out shapes out of them, and the most common shape of course was the teardrop shape and the almond shape, and these shapes were then used to embellish different things, because the teardrop shape worked very well in creating leaves and flowers, because you could put 5 of them together and create a flower, and then the almond shape worked for creating the leaves. So leaves and vines and leaves and wines worked very well for the Gota tradition, and because it was done in gold and silver, of course the combination of two was inevitable. So the whole concept of the Ganga Jamni, which meant silver and gold together, was then born. And not only was it only in Gota, but it was used in a lot of other metallic traditions as well, where gold and silver was combined. So the Ganga Jamni tradition was very apparent. And the advantage of Gota was that even though it was flat, you could actually double it up the ribbon and create a 3-dimensional flower out of it. And then Gota, because of the different sizes that they had, the broad and the narrow, you could make different shapes out of those things as well. So Gota proved to be a very flexible material after the invention of the Gota Patti. And this was actually kind of originated in the subcontinent, and it was then widely used all over the place. The Punjab tradition was interesting because they took the narrow piece of Gota and they folded it over, and they created small little pieces which were called tukdi. So you had Gota tukdi and you had Gota Patti. So the Gota Patti was the flat one which had no dimension to it, and the Gota tukdi was small little diamond shapes that were used in the Punjab tradition. So when you look at the Multani Gota, you look at the Gota that was done in the Punjab, you'll find that it has a completely different color. The thread that was used in that was often orange. So the orange and silver combined together to give you a copper hue, and it combined with the gold to give you a slightly reddish gold. So it was very interesting to see, and then of course because of innovation and because of demand, it was then used with a neutral thread, so it lost that double shaded effect that it used to have. So Gota was also very interesting because you could bend it and you could make different sizes out of it, and now of course because of the recent revival of Gota, you can order it in different shapes, you can order it in different colors. So you get the 3-pronged leaf of the Gota, you get the flower of the Gota. And village women generally fold the Gota, they press it and then they stitch it together to make the little flowers and the leaves. So the Gota tradition is also very much part and parcel of what is, very much surviving. It's survived, the times, and it's still very relevant as much as it was previously. And in Pakistan, there's been a huge revival. I mean, I think in a lot of other countries, I think it probably has died down. But in Pakistan, because, we celebrate all our festivals, a lot of the Muslim festivals, are celebrated with a lot of color and with a lot of, silver and gold and bling, and so the Gota tradition has kind of survived that. And I think in Pakistan today, it's probably one of the most requested items, because invariably when we are doing a wedding and people come for the bridal shower and they want to order stuff, they're always like, can you show us something in Gota, because we would like all the girls to wear Gota. So it's survived and it's progressed and it's become technically more sound, and I love Gota. I think it's just so beautiful. Also part of the revival, especially with us, especially as part of our, it's been our goal to maintain a lot of the old stitches that have been lost to time. And the Rizwan Beg label has always strived to continue to maintain its excellence. We work with village women. We started a project called Bunyad, which actually employs rural women and gives them a decent, honest livelihood. And we've actually taken a lot of the old masters that had come pre-partition and had come to Pakistan and had settled here, and a lot of them work for me. And they bought all the old antique stitches with them. And part of that tradition was the revival of Marodi. Now Marodi is incredibly difficult to do and very time consuming. It's a very labor intensive piece. And this was one of the pieces we talked about earlier, which was reserved for loyalty. So the piece you see behind me here is actually one of the old khakas of a traditionally Memoni Marodi gala. So the entire neckline and the way it's done together and the way the whole piece is put together is based on very old traditional crafts and also very old khakas. And of course the Marodi was done because it was a process by which you worked with the metal thread, which was like a dory, and you had to keep curving it around, making circles out of it. Usko marod ke, you had to keep twisting it. So the word Marodi comes from the word marodna, to twist it. So you push the needle through the fabric, you coil the yarn around it, and then you fixed it in place with two threads. And it was interesting because if the thread was gold, the dory was gold, the thread you use on it, you could change the thread and change the color of the Marodi. So if you stitched it with a black thread, it would become a bronze. If you stitched it with a red thread, it would become a red gold. If you stitched it with an orange thread, it would become a bright yellow gold. So that also gave people a lot of opportunity to experiment. And if you look at the old museum pieces, you'll find that there are a lot of variations in the way Marodi is done. This of course is a classic Marodi, a very old khaka that's actually come out of the history books, and it's pretty much universal because this is pretty much, you'll find the borders that we've used here you'll find them all over, because it's one of those things like the pan, which is the spade. So the blouse is also done in the same stitch, and you can see sometimes it's so dense that you can barely see the background of the fabric. The background of the fabric becomes secondary, and then of course the borders, and as in a sari you always have the edges, which is the pallu, which is the most kind of elaborate bit. So you can see here that the pallu is quite elaborate. And then of course the Persian thing, which is part and parcel of the Pakistan tradition definitely, is the buta. So the bute, which was what it was called in Farsi, the bute was actually very much part of the Mughal heritage. So if you look at old Mughal paintings, you'll find that the sides of the miniatures have little different kinds of Mughal bute. You have the lotus, and you have the rose, and you have the daffodil, and you have the tulip. All this became part and parcel of the whole Mughal floral tradition, because a lot of the stuff that was done based on the Mughal and on the Islamic tradition was not to depict the human form so much. So it was mostly flowers and birds and animals. So the bute of course survived, it continues to survive today. It's pretty much used anywhere where you want to take a large expanse of fabric and fill it with small bits of embroidery. That was something that of course translated into block print, it translated into screen print, and now of course on digital print. If you are attending this workshop and you've taken time out to be part of this whole thing, I would strongly request you to click on the link below, fill in all your descriptions in the description box so that you can get your certificate of attendance, which will be given to you by TTAP. So the traditions of these three other provinces, I mean obviously the embroideries of the Punjab are shared, because the Phulkari is also done in Punjab, Pakistan Punjab, and in India Punjab. But if you look at the other provinces and you look at the way they've been influenced by their surrounding geography, it's very interesting, and also by the climate. So when you look at Balochistan, you will find that because it was a desert and there was no kind of foliage there and there were no flowers there, it's very colorful, and it kind of permeated into Sindh, because Sindh was also desert. So you'll find there's a lot of color, and if you look at the communities of gypsies, and if you look at the Khana Badosh, what they're known as locally, and if you look at how they traveled, they always wore a lot of color. And because they traveled, for them there were no such thing as borders. For them to to walk into Kutch and then to walk out of Kutch was completely normal because they had no concept of boundaries. If you look at the Balochi and you look at the whole community of fishermen, you'll find the embellishment of lot of shells. You find a lot of seashells in their embroidery. When you look at the traditions in Balochistan, there's a lot of mirror work, and the mirror work comes from Oman because the Balochistan was a province of the Middle East and it was actually gifted to Pakistan very late. So a lot of the traditions of the Baddus, of the locals, a lot of the mirror work came from the Omani thing. And then again, because again boundaries were porous, you'll find the same mirror work in the topi of the Sindhi topi. So these were very fluid. The use of color, the use of yarn. You find a lot of woolen embroidery in Balochistan because the winters are very severe. Sindh, on the other hand, is very tropical. So you will find a lot of, thread work yahan pe. And the abochnai, which is a traditional Sindhi thing. And then, of course, the men's chadar that they wear. A lot of the colors that come from the Ajrak because of the old Indus Valley civilizations, and the galas that they do, that's also very, very typically Sindhi. A lot of mirror work you find over here, you find a lot of other kinds of embellishment. Bead work, you find a lot of bead work. So they make these little braids in bead and then they attach it to the edges of their necklines and their cuffs. And then again, if you look at the tradition of the Punjab is mostly silk embroideries and a lot of weaves. So the embroidery tradition of the Punjab is more texture based. And I think the most popular thing to come out of the Punjab in embroidery wise and the most famous is the Phulkari. Actually, it's a very interesting story. The Phulkari originated in Punjab because you'll find it's the one thing you find in India as well. In Delhi, you'll find a lot of Phulkari. In Pakistan, it was interesting because it was a Punjab tradition. And then because of migration, a lot of Punjabi women got married to Hazara men. So it went into Hazara. And then 3 generations of Hazara women married into the Swatis, into the Pathans. So it went into the Pashtuns. So the epicenter was actually the Punjab, and then it ended up becoming a specialty in Haripur. Hazara became the seat of Phulkari, and eventually it then travelled to the KPK, and a lot of Hazara women who had married Pathan men started practicing. And the difference is very obvious because the silk embroidery of Punjab and Haripur is the Bagh, which means garden. So it's floral. But all the embroidery that comes out of Swat is geometrical because of the influence of Afghanistan and Central Asia. And then of course the KPK also has very, very interesting things, like Cholistan has a lot of beautiful embroideries, again done with a lot of thread. And then Kafiristan, which is known for its black with its multicolored orange, red and yellow, and then the shocking pink, and the shells, because the shells have constantly been used, and coins, which is the Afghan tradition. So the coins get attached to it. So Pakistan is very diverse. And the Kashmiri influence, of course, because when you talk about Azad Kashmir and you talk about the paisley, which is typical of the thing, and the fine embroideries of Kashmir. Kashmir is high on artistry, high on craft, and the whole Kashmiri experience, when you go to places, you find the gabba, which is again with the arikas needle. It's the crewel embroidery which they do on upholstery, the white on white heavy canvas, the multicolored on heavy canvas. So the Pakistan tradition is very rich, and the shawls, of course, are the most popular, the Kashmiri shawl with the paisley and with the little single tanka borders, the very fine embroidery, and of course cashmere, the word cashmere, and the paisley. These are, of course, full experiences in themselves, the way they were woven into the Kani shawls, the way they were embroidered, and the kind of shapes that they took. So, I think it's going to take a lifetime to talk about embroidery, and I'm such a fan of embroidery. There's so much, I've learned so much, I've educated myself so much, actually gone and found out what the background of certain stitches were, tried to replicate them, and hopefully, we can continue to do this. So, of course, there's been a transition. There's no two things about it. As times have changed and as boundaries have disappeared and it's become a global village, obviously you're going to take influences from a lot of places, and then Pakistanis have always been very influenced by Western concepts and Western cultures. It's such an amazing, I think this country is an amazing melting pot of everything. I've always maintained that we live in 3 time zones. We live in the past, present and the future. So what is past is celebrated as heritage. What is present is what is happening on an everyday. And then there's a modern approach as to what to expect. So even in embroideries, techniques have changed, styles have changed, and there's been this whole revival of a great Western influence. So a lot of the stuff we now do, the Rizwan Beg label that now has taken on the mantle, is of replicating a lot of things that are very European in design. And this, of course, is a complete breakaway from tradition, because the white on white with sequins and pearls is not very much a local tradition. The whole thing, then we do the whole black and beige, which is a very French tradition. And again, this is all beaded, and it's reminiscent of the old 1960s pieces that you used to get, the French embroideries, again a lot of beads and a lot of sequins. So these are more modern interpretations, and of course to take a modern interpretation and to put it on a very traditional thing is like the sari that we do, for example. We do the saris with a lot of the heavy pearl work and on cotton net with lots of western touches in a western kind of a thing, and then of course the classic black and white, which is again a very modern approach to how modern. I mean, black and white is classic, and it's relevant in any culture. Whether you look at Japan. So the motifs what we've used are mostly Central Asian, because again we want to keep the embroidery technique is Western, but the motifs, because we're doing it on a sari, has to have some relevance. So we're not going in for the paisley, and we're not going in for typical Pakistan motifs. We are looking at something that is more kind of Central Asia. And these kind of motifs work well because a lot of expatriates, people who live abroad, they can kind of identify with this. And of course then this whole newfound friendship with a lot of the Central Asian states. Well, black and white is a very Victorian influence. I mean, the whole black and white thing is very Victorian. So you had the black velvet coat with the white ruff. So those kind of references we try and maintain, historically, and also nostalgia. This whole thing about, reliving the past, reliving your old stories, reliving what your grandmother wore, what you saw your puppies wearing. The influence of the 1950s movies that you saw people wearing these saris. For me, it's always been that. You sit and watch an old Nutan film where she's worn a black and white sari, and those kind of references, because in those days and age, if you look at the whole cinema experience, it was very influenced by Hollywood. And Hollywood was all about the tight dresses and the, it was replicated here in the teddy pants and the black and white and, all those kind of things. So I grew up watching all of that, and I'm a great fan of old cinema. So obviously, the visuals tend to kind of go round and round like a film reel in your head. But modern, Pakistan I think is an amazing place, because the thing is that we exist in so many different eras at the same time. So you can walk into a wedding and find somebody in a very modern outfit and somebody in a very traditional outfit. And I think this is the charm of this country, where you can actually be anyone, wear anything, and do, justice to what your heritage is all about. And this is something that makes me so proud to be a Pakistani.